4 years. 4 years tracking slavers across alien worlds. 4 years hunting for one stolen child. He finally reaches the camp, weapon ready, heart steeled for vengeance. He counts the guards, the cages, and finds something completely unexpected inside. The child inside wasn't Sarah. It wasn't even human. This one moment shatters his solitary mission and forces the most dangerous choice of his life. Leo made his approach like a soldier clearing hostile territory. His movements followed a strict calculation of angles of approach, sightlines, and probable enemy patrol routes. 4 years of tracking and surviving hostile worlds had honed him into something more instrument than man. Every decision became a cold equation of risk versus gain. 6 armed slavers paced the perimeter. 2 carried energy rifles that could burn through armor at 50 meters. The others had shock batons and sidearms. He noted their patrol patterns: 2 stationary near the main fire, 4 walking circuits that overlapped every 3 minutes. The cage sat in the center of the camp, a rusted metal box barely large enough for a child. The math was clear. Too many variables, too many armed targets. One mistake meant 4 years of searching ended here in the red dust of an unnamed moon. His finger rested against the trigger guard of his own rifle, feeling the familiar worn groove in the metal. Every instinct told him to pull back, to wait for a better moment when the odds improved. But one part of the equation stayed unresolved. The prisoner's value. His own daughter might be in that cage, or it might be empty, or it might hold someone else's child, which was almost worse. He had to know, had to be certain. He moved forward using the planet's low gravity to his advantage, each step covering more ground with less sound. The purplish scrub vegetation provided sparse cover. He kept to the shadows where the twin suns cast long, distorted shapes across the rocky ground. The air smelled of ozone and something sour like old machinery left to rot. The cage came into view. The metal bars were pitted and scarred. Something small and hunched occupied the far corner. He adjusted his position slightly, trying to get a clear line of sight through the gaps in the bars. His breath caught for just a second, a rare break in discipline. The child inside wasn't Sarah. The hair was wrong, too dark, too fine. The skin tone was all wrong too, carrying a faint blue undertone he'd never seen in a human. As his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw more details. The ears tapered to delicate points. The eyes, when they opened, held a luminous quality no human child possessed. It wasn't even human. The realization hit him like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. 4 years of tracking, of planning, of survival, all built around finding one specific girl. And here, at the moment of potential recovery, the equation introduced a variable he hadn't even considered. A non-human child, and complication that changed everything about his mission parameters. The azure-skinned girl watched him with unblinking eyes from the cage's farthest corner. She wore rags that might have been a tunic once, now torn and stained. Her wrists bore heavy metal cuffs connected by a short chain, the lock mechanism crusted with rust. She looked small for what he guessed was her age, with that malnourished thinness that spoke of too many missed meals. But she sat utterly still, not trembling or crying like a human child might in that situation. Her stillness felt deliberate, like a predator waiting in ambush, except she was clearly the prey. His training provided no protocol for this. The mission parameters calculated risk versus reward, cost versus objective. Saving a stranger introduced catastrophic variables. The slavers would alert their network. Every patrol in the sector would hunt them. 4 years of meticulous tracking toward a single goal, finding Sarah, would become infinitely more complicated, likely impossible. He felt the cold weight of that logic, the soldier's calculus that said leave the asset, preserve the mission. His hand stayed on his knife, but he didn't draw it yet. He'd seen that look before on other battlefields, on faces both young and old. It wasn't fear. It was resignation, the hollow acceptance of a fate too heavy to fight. Those heavy chains on her thin wrists were meant for a full-grown adult, not a child. They'd probably been put on her months ago and never adjusted as she grew thinner. Leaving her meant leaving her to slavers who might work her to death or sell her to worse. The moon's native predators hunted at night, drawn to weakness. Staying silent meant condemning her. Acting meant risking everything. He weighed 4 years of hunting against this single moment. 4 years of crossing star systems, following cold trails, surviving on ration bars and determination. Every decision had served one purpose. Saving this alien girl served none of them. It broke every rule of survival he'd lived by since his daughter was taken. The math was clear, and yet his hand moved to the lockpick set in his belt pouch instead of his weapon. The metal tools felt cold and familiar in his fingers. The lock mechanism was simple, a cheap model slavers used because they rarely needed quality. It yielded to his tools with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet evening air. He sliced through the chain connecting her cuffs with 2 sharp movements of his combat knife. The metal links fell to the dust with a dull thud. The girl didn't move at first, just watched him with those wide, luminous eyes. Then she slowly raised her freed hands, turning them over as if not believing they were loose. He'd come to kill slavers and find his daughter. Instead, he'd just made the most dangerous choice of the last 4 years. The hunter had become a protector in one silent action, and everything that followed would flow from this moment of interrupted vengeance. He needed a name for her. Practicality demanded identification, something to call her besides the girl or the Azuran. In the field, clarity saved time and lives. He remembered a cobalt blue flower he'd seen on a remote mining outpost years ago, a stubborn bit of beauty thriving in cracked rock. The locals called it Nia's bloom. The name felt right, short, simple, and it matched her skin tone. He tested it aloud once, a low, gravelly word in the quiet of their makeshift camp. She looked up from the nutrient paste he'd given her. Her large eyes focused on him, unblinking. Naming her felt dangerous. It created a connection, a point of attachment he couldn't afford. His entire existence for 4 years had been built on detachment, on moving through worlds without leaving a trace or forming bonds. This child was a complication, a weight he'd chosen to carry. A name made her a person, not just a problem. He started with signals, the universal language of survival. A raised open hand meant stop. A downward press of his palm meant get low, hide. A single finger to his lips meant quiet. He demonstrated each one slowly, deliberately. He expected a learning curve, a human child's frustration or confusion. She learned the signals in one viewing. Her movements were precise, efficient recreations of his own. She didn't just mimic. She understood the context, applying hide when a scavenger bird circled overhead, using quiet when distant engine sounds echoed across the canyon. Her speed was unsettling, a reminder that she wasn't human, that her mind worked on different parameters. Her silence became a constant presence. She rarely made sound, moving with a natural stealth that made his own footfalls seem clumsy and loud. He was a soldier, trained in fieldcraft, but next to her he felt like a bull in a crystal shop. Her quiet observation felt like a judgment on his noisy human methods. It pushed him to be better, to move with more care, to listen more than he spoke. His plan remained unchanged. He would take her to the first settlement they found, leave her with someone who could get her home. It was the logical move, the way to shed this unexpected responsibility and return to his real mission. Settlements meant potential safety for her, a chance to reconnect with her own people. But settlements also meant danger. They meant questions from authorities or worse, from slaver sympathizers embedded in port bureaucracies. They meant potential traps, places where a lone man with an exotic alien child would be remembered and reported. Every outpost bulletin board carried offers of reward for information on specific fugitives or stolen merchandise. Dropping her off might sign both their death warrants. He used the name again as they prepared to break camp. Nia, time to move. She was tightening the straps on her small pack, a bundle of salvaged supplies he'd rigged for her. At the sound of her name, she paused and looked at him. For the first time, her lips curved into a small, definite smile. It wasn't a wide human grin, but a subtle upward tilt at the corners that reached her eyes. It was a look of recognition, of ownership. It was a claim. That small smile settled it. The attachment he had feared, the emotional risk he had tried to avoid, took root in that dusty campsite. She was no longer just the unwanted variable in his mission math. She was Nia. The ridgeback came at dusk, a blur of armored plates and hooked claws. It erupted from the scrub without warning, moving faster than anything that size had a right to move. The air filled with a sound like grinding stone and raw fury. Leo had a second to react. He shoved Nia toward a narrow crevice in the rocks, a fissure too small for the beast to follow. She slipped into the shadowed gap without protest, her eyes wide but calm. He brought his energy rifle up and fired twice. The blue bolts hit the ridgeback's thick shoulder plates and dissipated in crackling sparks. The hide didn't just resist the shots. It absorbed them. The creature shook itself like a dog after rain, then focused on him completely. Its 6 legs gave it a low, powerful stance and terrifying balance. It could pivot faster than he could aim, covering ground in lunges that defied its bulk. It charged. He sidestepped, but a foreclaw caught his side armor. The reinforced plating cracked under the impact, a sound like breaking bones. The force of it spun him, sent him stumbling. Pain lanced through his ribs, sharp and hot. He lost his footing on the loose scree, his rifle flying from his grasp to skitter across the dust and vanish into the growing darkness. The Ridgeback didn't pause. It was on him before he could rise, its weight pinning his legs. Its massive head dipped, jaws opening to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Its breath smelled of carrion and hot metal. It eyed him for the killing bite, a predator certain of its meal. He braced, hands coming up to uselessly guard his throat, his mind already calculating the angle of attack, the damage it would do. There was no escape this time. Then movement flickered at the edge of his vision. A small blue form launched from the safety of the rock crevice. Nia moved with a speed that mirrored the beast's own terrifying quickness. She didn't scream or shout. She was utterly silent, a dart of focused intent. She used a jagged outcrop as a stepping stone, propelling herself onto the Ridgeback's broad back. The beast startled, confused by the sudden weight on its spine. It jerked its head up, trying to twist and see what had landed there. Its attention shifted from the kill beneath it to the nuisance on its back. That moment of distraction was all she needed. Leo saw the glint of the small survival knife he'd given her, its blade catching the last light of the setting suns. She drove the knife down with both hands, putting her whole slight weight behind the thrust. The point found a gap in the armored plates at the base of the creature's neck, a weakness he hadn't seen. She shoved it deep, twisted, and pulled it free. Dark, viscous fluid welled from the wound. The Ridgeback roared, a sound of shocked pain and rage, and bucked violently. She held on for a second longer, then leapt clear, landing in a silent crouch a few meters away. The beast staggered, its coordination failing. It took 2 clumsy steps, then its front legs gave way. It collapsed onto its side, breathing in ragged, wet gasps. The fight went out of it quickly. The child he had protected, the variable he had tried to shield, had just become his protector. She stood watching the dying creature, her small chest rising and falling rapidly, the bloody knife held steady in her hand. Leo tended his wounds in the bleak quiet that followed the kill. His side throbbed where the Ridgeback's claw had fractured his armor. The cracked plating dug into his ribs with every breath. He was cleaning the gash with purified water from his canteen when Nia returned. She moved without sound, as always, appearing at his side holding a cluster of deep green leaves veined with silver. She didn't offer them, just began crushing them between her palms with a practiced motion. The sharp, clean scent of the pulp hit the air. It smelled like menthol and wet stone. She wordlessly applied the paste to his injured side. The effect was immediate and surprising, a cooling numbness that soothed the burning pain. Her knowledge was practical, ancient, pulled from a cultural memory he couldn't access. He watched her work, her small fingers deft and sure. This wasn't a child playing medic. This was a practiced application of survival lore. Her actions implied a bond, a connection he hadn't authorized or requested. He had saved her from a cage, and she had saved him from a predator. The ledger felt unbalanced, a debt hanging between them that complicated his clean, solitary mission. He was used to transactions, not obligations. He finished securing a clean bandage over her poultice and looked at her. Her luminous eyes were steady on his. "You saved my life back there," he said. The words felt too formal, too heavy for the dusty campsite. She simply nodded. Not a nod of pride or acknowledgement, but one of acceptance. As if his statement was a simple fact of the universe, like the rising of the twin suns. It was expected, inevitable. Her calm certainty was more unnerving than the Ridgeback's attack had been. Weeks later, they encountered Garrett's trading caravan on the edge of the salt flats. The grizzled caravan leader shared water and information around a low fire. Leo mentioned the incident with the Ridgeback, the girl's intervention. Garrett listened, his eyes flicking to where Nia sat silently observing the horizon. "Azarin life debt," Garrett said, as if explaining the weather. "It's a core part of their culture. Not a choice, really. More like a physical law. You save an Azuran's life, they incur a debt. They're bound to you until it's repaid in kind. Balance must be restored. It's about cosmic equilibrium, or so their mystics say." The explanation landed with the weight of a sentencing. Leo looked over at Nia. Her quiet companionship, her swift obedience, her deadly efficiency. It wasn't just gratitude or Stockholm Syndrome. It was service. A contractual obligation written in something deeper than blood or law. She wasn't just a lost child traveling with him. She was serving a debt. Her presence was a choice, but not her own. This changed everything. The dynamic shifted in his mind, the pieces reassembling into a new picture. She was not a ward to be protected or a burden to be delivered to safety. She was a partner bound by a code he barely understood. Her silence became strategic patience. Her observational skills became advanced reconnaissance. Her uncanny abilities became assets, not oddities. The unwanted variable in his mission math transformed into a potential force multiplier. Her presence was no longer a complication to his goal of finding Sarah. It became the one thing that might make achieving it possible. The Azuran caves provided everything she needed: safety deep in the mountain's heart, kinship with those who shared her blood and her silent language, warmth from the geothermal vents, food from the cultivated fungal gardens. It was a complete world hidden from slavers and the harsh surface. Leaving it made no logical sense. Leo expected her to stay. He intended to leave her there. It was the optimal tactical decision for her survival. The mission into Central Market was a different kind of danger, one he was prepared to face alone. Her refusal was quiet, but absolute. She stood before the clan elders, then turned to face him. She shook her head once. Her large, luminous eyes held no trace of doubt. Her insistence felt like a child's stubbornness, an emotional reaction he didn't have time to manage. He was a soldier on a clock, with a target location and a fragile plan. He couldn't afford to debate with a little girl about what was best for her. She didn't argue with emotion. She stated a fact. She spoke the words in her own language first, then repeated them in halting, carefully practiced trade speak for his benefit. The debt is not finished. The life is saved, but the balance is not restored. She made a precise gesture with her right hand, thumb and forefinger almost touching. The tie is still here. It binds. She was citing the life debt not as a feeling, but as a binding condition under her people's ancient custom. It was a law, not a request. Later, beside their packed gear, he sought confirmation from Garrett. The trader listened, scratched his beard, and nodded slowly. She's right, you know. It's not a request. For her people, it's a compulsion. A debt of life is a physical weight on their spirit. It has to be discharged through direct service. They believe imbalance in one life creates ripples in all things. You can't refuse her. It would be like refusing a body air. It would break her. Leo tried reason. He laid out the facts as he saw them. The caves were secure. Her people could protect her. The market was a nest of slavers and killers. The chances of violent exposure were high. She would be safer here, far from the coming conflict. She was a child, and he was heading into a war she didn't need to fight. Every tactical assessment screamed for him to leave her behind. She listened to his arguments with a patience that felt ancient. When he finished, she looked at the weapons he was checking, then back at his face. Her reply was simple, delivered in that flat, factual tone. Safe is not the question. The debt is the question. My aid must be direct. It must be for your quest. To stay here is to fail the debt. Her logic was alien and immovable. Her safety was irrelevant to the equation. Fulfilling the obligation was the only variable that mattered. The realization settled on him. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of terms. Her presence was no longer a choice he got to make for her. She had made it. She wasn't asking for permission to come along as a passenger. She was declaring her role as a participant. The dynamic in the cavern shifted. He looked at her not as a ward to be protected, but as a small, determined ally stating her terms. Her choice forced a fundamental change. The mission was no longer a solo infiltration. It was now a two-person operation. She transformed from a liability he carried into a member of the crew. A committed participant with her own stake in the outcome, bound not by his command but by a cultural imperative he barely understood. The weight of sole responsibility for her safety lessened, replaced by the new weight of coordinated action. The path ahead was still incredibly dangerous, but he would not be walking it alone. They assembled a trading party using minerals provided by the mountain clan. The Azuran elders offered raw crystals that pulsed with a soft inner light, a rare geological formation found only in the deepest, most unstable tunnels. Their value wasn't just in their beauty. but in their unique energy-conducting properties useful for advanced tech and weapons systems. This wasn't a random selection of goods. It was a calculated offering, bait designed to attract the kind of powerful, discerning buyer who might also traffic in rare lives. Legitimate trade provided the perfect cover. A merchant party moving valuable goods drew a different kind of attention than a lone warrior or a pair of fugitives. Customs inspections were more about tariffs than wanted bulletins. Market security was there to protect commerce, not necessarily to interrogate every single trader. It offered a path through the main gates without raising alarms, a way to get deep inside the fortress of Central Market without firing a single shot. Playing the merchant role required a skill set Leo utterly lacked. He understood tactics, threat assessment, and field medicine. He didn't understand haggling, market fluctuations, or the nuanced lies of commerce. His face was set in a permanent grimace, his posture that of a soldier, not a salesman. Every instinct told him to watch the exits and count the guards, not to discuss mineral purity and credit transfers. Garrett took the lead on negotiations. The seasoned trader knew the language of deals, the rhythm of offer and counteroffer. He could spin tales of the crystal's origin and rarity with a convincing smile. He handled the talking. Leo's job was to stand silently at his shoulder, a hulking presence of implied security. He was the muscle, the silent partner whose very stillness suggested a capacity for violence if the deal went sour. It was a role he could play, one that required intimidation, not conversation. Nia's role was the most critical and the most dangerous. She remained hidden. They modified a large storage crate, lining it with sound-dampening foam and adding a discreet air filter. Inside, she had enough room to sit or lie down, along with a canteen and a few ration bars. She was their secret, their Azuran connection. Her presence in the open would be a flashing beacon to every slaver and informant in the market. Contained, she was their most valuable and invisible asset. The plan was to reveal her only if absolutely necessary, as a final, irresistible bargaining chip to get a meeting with Darius himself. The value of the minerals was their key. They were rare enough, exotic enough to interest the top-tier power brokers who operated from private suites deep within the market complex. These were the individuals Darius would cater to, the clients who could request a private viewing of his most prestigious merchandise. The crystals were the ticket to that inner circle. This strategy drastically reduced the immediate risk to Nia. She was hidden, protected by layers of deception and the assumed innocence of a legitimate trader. She wouldn't be exposed to random patrols or marketplace scans. The danger was concentrated at the moment of the deal, not spread across their entire presence in the market. It was a calculated containment of risk. The approach demanded a brutal kind of patience. It meant walking through the belly of the beast and not reacting to the injustices on display. It meant seeing other captives in cages and having to look away, to maintain the facade of a disinterested merchant. It meant waiting for appointments, following protocols, and smiling at corrupt officials. For a man fueled by 4 years of vengeful urgency, the delay was a form of torture. They presented their forged credentials at the outer checkpoint. The guard scanned the crate of glowing minerals, noted their listed value on the manifest, and waved them through with a bored gesture. They passed into the sprawling chaos of the Central Market's main thoroughfares. They were inside. Leo kept his face neutral, his hands relaxed at his sides. The soldier who had planned a frontal assault was gone. In his place stood a quiet, intimidating merchant's guard. Vengeance had learned to wear a patient, calculating smile. Garrett's caravan offered real supplies, not just scavenged scraps. They had clean water, fresh ration packs, and medical gel for his healing ribs. But their real value wasn't in the goods. They knew the passes through the Ridgeback territories, the safe routes carved over generations of trade. Leo needed that knowledge. He couldn't afford another encounter like the last one, not with Nia in tow. The price for safe passage was information and shared vigilance. A fair trade on the surface. Garrett's curiosity about Nia felt like a probe testing weak armor. The caravan leader's eyes lingered on her too long. He noted her silence, her unusual grace, the specific shade of her skin. He didn't ask direct questions, just made quiet observations that circled the truth. Leo kept his answers short and vague. He called her his ward, a term that felt both true and a complete lie. He positioned himself between her and the traders. his posture unconsciously shifting to a guardian's stance whenever Garrett came near. Trust was a currency he spent sparingly. The caravan leader finally voiced his suspicion one evening as they shared a pot of bitter black tea. He gestured with his chin toward Nia, who was watching the horizon. Her people are from the deep valleys, yes? The crystal caves. Azurans don't often travel this far into the dry lands, not unless they have no choice. He said it casually, but the recognition was precise. He knew what she was, and that knowledge felt dangerous in a man who traded across star systems. Garrett sipped his tea, his eyes sharp over the rim of the cup. A man like that, a collector. He'd pay a fortune for something so rare, for a pristine, exotic merchandise. The word merchandise hung in the air, ugly and cold. It was the first time Leo had heard the name, a data point falling into the void of his search. A lead, however faint, Leo didn't hesitate. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out the photograph. The edges were soft from 4 years of handling, the colors faded by sweat and sun. He laid it on the crate between them. The image showed a little girl with sandy hair and a gap-toothed smile, holding a handmade doll. Her name is Sarah, human, taken 4 years ago from a mining outpost on Titan's Reach. Is she merchandise he would collect? One of Garrett's people, a woman named Anya who handled their communications array, leaned forward. She had a networker's calm demeanor, but her eyes turned hard. She looked from the photo to Leo's face. Darius's network trades in anything of value, or artifacts sentient lives. He doesn't discriminate. If there's credit to be made, he has a buyer. Central Market is his main hub. It's where the rarest lots move. Central Market wasn't just a trading post or a space station. It was an empire built on a single principle. Everything has a price. It operated in a legal gray zone between 3 systems, a place where jurisdiction was a rumor and security was private, brutal, and absolute. It was a fortress of commerce where slavers like Darius weren't outlaws. They were respected franchise holders. The scale of it dwarfed his concept of a simple raid. This wasn't a camp of 6 guards. It was an entire ecosystem of corruption. Garrett saw the calculation in Leo's eyes, the shift from assault plan to grim reassessment. The trader made a low sound in his throat. You won't blast your way in. Not even with an army. Their security would shred you before you cleared the outer docks. He tapped a finger on the crate next to the faded photo. But a trader with a unique offering, someone with goods rare enough to warrant a private meeting with a top-tier broker, that person gets past the gates. That person gets invited inside. The suggestion landed and held. Vengeance required a frontal assault, a soldier's solution. This required patience, deception, and a merchant's smile. Leo's mission, forged in 4 years of violent pursuit, pivoted on a trader's words. The goal remained the same: find Sarah. But the method transformed completely. They would trade instead of raid. Nia led him underground. The entrance was a fissure hidden behind a waterfall that poured from a mineral-streaked cliff. The air changed as they descended, growing cool and damp. The rough-hewn tunnel walls gave way to smooth, natural stone. Then the light changed. Faint blue and green luminescence bloomed on the walls and ceiling, cast by fungi and lichen that pulsed with a soft, slow rhythm. The cave felt utterly alien, a world of whispering echoes and shifting shadows. Yet it also felt safe, a hidden place untouched by slavers or scanners. The only sounds were the drip of distant water and their own quiet footsteps. A small group of Azurans awaited them in a broad cavern. Their skin held the same blue tone as Nia's, their eyes the same luminous quality. They regarded Leo with calm curiosity, not fear. An elder stood forward, her face a map of fine lines. She spoke to Nia in a language of soft clicks and flowing vowels. Nia responded in kind, her gestures formal and respectful. The elder then turned her gaze to Leo. She didn't speak a word he understood. Instead, she drew symbols in the air with her long fingers. A spiral, a cluster of dots, single straight line. It was a language of concepts, not directions. He felt the frustration of a soldier who needed coordinates, grid references, a tangible destination. Another Azuran, a younger woman named Lyra, stepped forward. She placed a hand on the largest crystal formation in the chamber, a spire of milky white stone that rose from the floor to the ceiling. It began to glow from within, a light that was warm and inviting. Lyra gestured for Leo to approach. He placed his own hand on the cool, smooth surface. The stone felt strangely alive under his palm, humming with a low energy. Lyra's voice was a soft guide. She told him to focus, to concentrate on his daughter's memory, to push everything else away. He closed his eyes. He focused on Sarah. He pictured her laugh, the exact shade of her hair, the way she used to clutch his finger with her small hand. He remembered reading her stories at night, the sound of her breathing as she fell asleep. The memories were sharp, painful. He concentrated until his head ached with the effort of holding the image so perfectly. The crystal's inner light shifted. Images began to form within the milky quartz, cloudy at first, then clearing. He saw a marketplace, a chaotic swirl of stalls and aliens under a domed roof. The vision sharpened, focusing on a specific building, a structure with a distinctive arched entrance. The image dissolved, then reformed. Now it showed a different place, a sterile mining complex on an airless moon. Conveyor belts carried raw ore. Figures in environment suits moved between industrial structures. The vision held on a specific habitation module, its serial number partially visible on the airlock door. Then a single object appeared, floating in the crystal's heart. A doll. Its yarn hair was messy, one button eye was missing, and its dress was a faded patchwork. It was the doll Sarah had carried everywhere, the one her grandmother had made for her. The one from the photograph in his pocket. The image of the doll held for a long moment, a silent, heartbreaking confirmation. The elder spoke again through Lyra. Her warning was solemn. The path is dark. The one you seek is hidden in shadow, her own light veiled. The dangers are many and real. She paused, her ancient eyes holding his. But the path is not without hope. The thread is thin, but it is not broken. The words were vague, but the intent was clear. This was a risk, not a certainty. The vision faded from the crystal, its light returning to a soft glow. He took his hand from the stone. He had come seeking mystical guidance, half expecting vague portents and useless prophecies. Instead, he had received actionable intelligence. The vision gave him a location. He now had a specific marketplace to find and a specific mining complex linked to it. The mysticism he doubted had delivered a tactical advantage he couldn't ignore. Central Market swallowed them whole. The noise hit first. A constant roar of engines shouted commerce and the screech of alien languages. Motion followed. A chaotic flow of beings pushing through crowded avenues under the flickering glow of neon signs and holographic ads. The scale of the place was staggering. A pressurized dome city built on a foundation of pure, brutal commerce. Everything was for sale, and every transaction had a victor and a victim. The place operated on a simple, harsh principle. Value determined worth. Sentience was a secondary concern. Leo kept his posture relaxed, his eyes constantly moving. Every uniformed guard represented a potential threat. Each one carried a scanner that could check their forged merchant credentials against a central database. A single alert would bring a swift, violent response. Their entire plan balanced on a fragile lie, and every passing second increased the risk of exposure. The stalls lining the main concourse offered a grim inventory of the market's morals. One booth displayed gleaming energy weapons alongside primitive ballistic firearms. Another held cages of shivering, multi-limbed creatures, some docile, some snapping at the bars. Then came the beings. Not in open cages here, not on the main floor, but displayed in transparent holding cells. Their eyes held the same hollow look he'd seen in Nia's cage, a mix of fear and broken resignation. The air was thick with conflicting smells. The sharp tang of ozone from faulty wiring, the heavy odor of unwashed bodies from a dozen species, and underneath it all, the sour scent of despair. It was the smell of a place that traded in lives. They moved with deliberate pace, following the flow of heavier traffic toward the secured sector. The special merchandise building stood apart from the market chaos, a fortified structure of dark metal and reinforced glass. Access was controlled by a single main entrance flanked by 2 private security teams. These weren't the lax concourse guards. Their armor was newer, their weapons were military-grade, and their postures were alert and professional. Their eyes scanned the crowd not for pickpockets, but for threats. This was the inner sanctum, and its guardians were not fooled by merchant disguises. Getting past that door required more than a good story and a crate of glowing rocks. A direct approach was suicide. Leo assessed the entrance. 2 teams of 4. Overlapping fields of fire. Retractable blast doors visible in the ceiling. This was a hard target. Garrett saw the same assessment in Leo's eyes. The trader gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The plan was always going to hinge on a distraction. It was time. Garrett moved away from them, blending into the crowd near the main gate of the special merchandise building. He didn't look back. A moment later, a loud argument erupted near the security checkpoint. Garrett's voice rose above the market din, shouting about unfair tariffs and corrupt officials. He shoved a crate of his own goods, spilling inferior ore across the clean floor. The commotion was immediate and effective. The professional guards at the special merchandise entrance turned their attention toward the disruption. Protocols demanded they secure their post, but human curiosity was a powerful pull. Their formation tightened. Facing the noise, their focus diverted for a handful of precious seconds. It was the only window they would get. Leo didn't hesitate. He adjusted his grip on the crate containing Nia and moved. He didn't run. Running drew eyes. He walked with purpose, a servant delivering a package, straight toward the now unobserved side entrance of the special merchandise building. He used a keycard Garrett had procured through less legitimate channels. The lock clicked. The door slid open into a dim, quiet hallway. The shouting from the main gate faded behind him as the door sealed shut. They were inside the lion's den. The marketplace chaos was replaced by the sterile, silent threat of Darius's private domain. The door to Darius's study was a solid sheet of reinforced alloy, but the lock was a standard commercial model. Leo worked his picks with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The mechanism yielded with a soft click. He entered, closing the door behind him and sealing them back into silence. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the sterile corridors. Opulence dripped from every surface. Thick carpets muffled his steps. A large desk of polished dark wood dominated the space. The walls were lined with shelves, but they didn't hold data chips or account ledgers. They held trophies. Weapons from a dozen cultures hung in display cases, each spotlit from above. Intricate artifacts and statuettes sat on velvet cushions. A set of ornate drinking vessels made from polished horn gleamed under the lights. This wasn't an office for work. It was a gallery of conquest, a shrine to acquisitions. Every object represented a deal closed, a rival outmaneuvered, a life commodified. The air smelled of expensive polish and something else, something vain and possessive. The room felt deeply personal, a glimpse into the mind of the man he had hunted for so long. It was the lair of a predator who enjoyed admiring his own teeth. His eyes scanned the shelves systematically, searching for anything that might indicate Sarah's location, a manifest, a shipping order, a custody record. He saw nothing useful, just more evidence of wealth and ego. His frustration began to build, a cold knot in his stomach. Then his gaze stopped. High on a shelf, tucked between a carved jade figurine and a mounted energy pistol, something sat that didn't belong with the other treasures. It was small. It was soft. It was worn. Perched on the high shelf was a doll. Its yarn hair was matted and frizzed from years of childish love. One of its button eyes was missing, the empty socket a dark void. Its dress was a faded patchwork fabric, hand-stitched with a slightly crooked seam. He knew every detail of that dress, every stray thread. He had watched his own mother sew it by lamplight. It was Sarah's doll, the one she refused to sleep without. The one from the photograph worn soft in his pocket. The one from the Azuran crystal vision. The sight of it there, treated as just another curio in a slaver's collection, sent a jolt of pure rage through him. This wasn't a weapon or a valuable artifact. It was a piece of a child's soul, a touchstone of home and safety. Darius had taken it. He had handled it. He had put it on a shelf next to his other prizes, as if it were equivalent to a piece of jade or a fancy gun. This act felt more violating than if he'd found a photograph of her. It was a physical confirmation that the man had touched her life, had stripped away her childhood comforts and displayed them for his own amusement. The Azuran vision had been true in every detail. The crystal had shown him the doll, and here it was. The mystical guidance he had half-doubted had delivered him to this exact spot. The confirmation was absolute and devastating. Darius had her. He had touched her things. He was here somewhere in this complex, and so was she. The 4 years of searching, the star systems crossed, the risks taken, all of it narrowed to this single horrible room and the knowledge that his daughter was somewhere beyond the next door. The hunt was over. The rescue was about to begin. He found her in a private room down a quiet hall. It wasn't a cell. The space was clean, well lit. with a bed that had real sheets and a small table holding a half-finished meal. She sat on the edge of the bed, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. She looked cared for physically. Her hair was clean and brushed. She wore simple but new clothes. But her eyes were the problem. They held no light, no curiosity. They watched the door with a flat, empty caution, like a soldier waiting for the next order. She was present, but not there. He opened the door slowly, keeping his movements predictable. He made sure his hands were visible, held away from his body and his weapons. He stepped inside and let the door shut behind him. The room was silent except for the low hum of the environmental systems. She didn't startle. She didn't stand up. Her eyes tracked him, assessing. They showed no spark of recognition, only a wary calculation. She looked at him the way she might look at a new guard coming on shift, a potential source of instruction or punishment, not a person. He stayed near the door, giving her space. He kept his voice low and even, the way he'd speak to a spooked animal. "Sarah," he said. Her name felt strange in his mouth after so long. She didn't react. Her expression remained blank. He tried again, putting more weight into the word, "Sarah." Then he added, "It's Leo, your father." He watched her face for any flicker, any sign that the words meant something. There was nothing. Her gaze stayed cool and detached. He pushed further, using the old anchors, the things that were supposed to mean home. "Do you remember Earth? The big oak tree in the backyard? Your mom reading to you at night?" He listed the details slowly, painting a picture of a life that felt a million miles away. He mentioned the smell of rain on hot pavement, the sound of the old mining shuttle arriving at dawn, the taste of the berry pie her mother used to bake. Each memory was a hook cast into deep, still water. He waited for a tug on the line. Her expression didn't change. The names and places landed on the surface of her consciousness and sank without a ripple. The conditioning ran deep, smoothing over any crack in the facade. She had been broken and reassembled into something that obeyed, something that didn't look back. The person she had been was locked away, and he didn't have the key. The failure of it pressed down on him, a weight colder than any alien moon. He took a slow step forward, then another. He didn't reach for her. He just lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. He held out his right hand, palm up, empty. An offer, not a demand. A silent question. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just studied his hand, then his face, then his hand again. The calculation in her eyes was purely tactical. Was this a test? A new command disguised as a choice? Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible shift of her weight, she leaned forward. One foot slid off the edge of the bed and touched the floor. Then the other. She stood, her movements precise and controlled. She took one tentative step toward him, then another. She stopped just out of arm's reach, her eyes still on his outstretched hand. She hesitated for another heartbeat, then slowly, carefully, she lifted her own hand. Her fingers hovered just above his palm, not quite touching. It was a tiny movement, a minuscule breach in her programming. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't love or memory. It was the faintest possible echo of trust. A single note played on a string that had been silent for years. It was a beginning. The door hissed open. Darius stood there, framed in the doorway, a smile already on his face. He wore expensive tailored clothes that whispered of wealth and comfort, a stark contrast to the functional gear of his guards. He carried no visible weapon. His confidence was his armor. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space with the satisfied air of a man completely in control of his domain. He didn't look at the girl on the bed. His focus was on the man standing before her. He saw the stance, the gear, the grim expression, and he misread it completely. He took Leo for another buyer. A wealthy, perhaps discreet client, interested in a very specific and well-broken-in piece of merchandise. His smile widened, becoming a practiced tool of negotiation. "Ah, you've come to see the product in person. A wise choice. Her documentation is flawless, of course. A rare find from the outer colonies. Untraceable." His voice was smooth, cultured, the kind of voice that could sell you poison and make you thank him for it. The charm was a veneer, thin and polished over a core of pure avarice. Leo said nothing. He just watched the man, his body coiled tight. Darius misinterpreted the silence as a buyer's scrutiny. He took a step closer, his eyes gliding over Sarah as if she were a piece of furniture. The key with this particular model, he said, his tone conversational, almost proud, was patience. No brash methods, no crude tools. It's a delicate process, breaking a spirit gently. You have to make them forget there was ever anything else. Make the cage feel like the whole world. It takes time, but the result is a perfectly compliant asset. No fuss, no troublesome memories. He spoke of her conditioning like a vintner discussing a fine wine's aging process. The calculated cruelty in his words hung in the air, colder than the room's climate control. Leo's right hand moved. It didn't jerk or flinch. It was a slow, deliberate shift, dropping to the worn handle of the combat knife sheathed on his belt. The movement was pure instinct, a predator's final adjustment before the strike. It was a soldier's motion, not a merchant's. Darius's eyes, sharp and accustomed to reading subtleties in a deal, caught the shift. The charming smile faltered. His gaze flicked from Leo's face to his moving hand, then to the girl on the bed and back to Leo's eyes. The pieces reassembled in his mind, forming a new and terrifying picture. The client wasn't a client. The calculation in the man's stare wasn't about a purchase. It was about a reckoning. Darius's mouth opened. He drew a sharp breath to shout, to call his guards to sound an alarm, but the breath never became sound. Leo's arm was already in motion. The knife left his hand in a single fluid throw, a flick of his wrist putting all his weight and training behind it. The blade spun once in the air, a flat silver disc catching the light. It crossed the short distance between them before Darius could finish his inhalation. The point struck his throat just above the collar of his fine jacket. The impact was a dull, wet thud. The force of it slammed Darius back against the doorframe. His eyes went wide with shock, then confusion. His hands came up, fingers clutching feebly at the knife handle protruding from his neck. The shout died in a choked, gurgling rasp. He slid down the frame to the floor, his expensive clothes pooling around him. His eyes glazed over, staring at nothing. The charm, the cruelty, the entire empire of misery he had built, extinguished in a heartbeat. 4 years of waiting. 4 years of tracking across star systems, 4 years of clinging to a single purpose through loss and exhaustion. It ended here on a clean carpet in a quiet room, with the cold precision of a thrown blade. Vengeance had not been a roar or a battle. It was a whisper. It was done. The alarms didn't wail. They screamed, a piercing, undulating shriek that locked down every corridor and door in the sector. Red emergency lighting replaced the calm white glow, casting the hallways in a bloody hue. Security protocols activated faster than he'd anticipated. Hatches slammed shut with the sound of heavy bolts driving home. Distant voices shouted commands over the din. The response wasn't the disorganized scramble of a camp. It was the drilled, efficient reaction of a private army protecting its most valuable assets. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by an immediate and overwhelming counter-assault. Leo scooped Sarah into his arms. She was light, too light for her age, but she didn't struggle. She went rigid, her body a board of tense muscle, her eyes wide but still unseeing. Carrying her was like carrying a piece of expensive, fragile equipment. He couldn't return fire effectively. He couldn't take cover properly. Every movement had to consider her safety first, his own survival second. He was a soldier reduced to a shield, his offensive capabilities crippled. His rifle felt heavy and useless in one hand while the other supported her weight. The first 2 guards rounded the corner ahead, rifles coming up. They wore full tactical armor, visors down, their movements synchronized and professional. Leo dropped to a knee, using his body to block Sarah, and brought his own weapon up one-handed. It was a clumsy, desperate shot. The energy bolt went wide, splashing against the ceiling. The guards didn't flinch. They took aim. Then the crate they'd carried in burst open. The lid flew back and Nia emerged. She moved in a single fluid motion, uncoiling from her hiding place. In her hands was a compact bow made of a sleek dark wood, a weapon he hadn't known she possessed. She didn't aim. She simply drew and released. The arrow was a blur. It struck the first guard in the gap between his breastplate and shoulder guard. The man grunted, his rifle dipping as his arm went limp. She had already knocked a second arrow. The release was just as swift. This one found the eye slit of the second guard's helmet. He dropped without a sound. More guards poured into the hallway from the other end. Their boots echoed on the hard floor. Leo fired, forcing them to take cover, but he was pinned. They began to lay down suppressive fire, energy bolts sizzling past his head, chewing chunks out of the wall behind him. He was trapped between two converging squads, a defenseless child in his arms. Nia didn't hesitate. She planted her feet, becoming a small, still center in the storm of noise and light. Her bow rose and fell with the machine's rhythm. Each draw was smooth. Each release was certain. Her arrows weren't random shots. They targeted weaknesses. A wrist exposed around a rifle grip. A knee joint in the armor. The narrow space under a raised visor. She didn't kill every time. She wounded, she distracted, she forced reactions. A guard would scream and spin away, disrupting the advance of the others. Her aim created chaos where there had been order. She wasn't just firing arrows. She was weaving a path. Each shot created a moment of hesitation, a flinch, a space to move. She was reading the flow of the fight faster than the trained guards could. Her covering fire wasn't a barrage. It was a precise, deadly dissection of their momentum. She turned their advance into a staggered, confused retreat. A corridor of relative safety opened through the chaos, a temporary hole punched in their defensive net. Leo moved. He ran, hunched over Sarah, using the brief windows Nia's shots provided. He didn't look back. He trusted the sharp thrum of her bowstring, the choked cries of the guards. He focused on the exit hatch at the end of the hall, the one they'd come in through. It felt a mile away. Energy bolts scorched the air around him. He felt the heat on his neck. They reached the hatch. He slapped the release Garrett had provided. The door slid open. He stumbled through into the relative quiet of the service corridor beyond. Nia backed through the doorway after him, firing 2 more shots down the hall to keep their pursuers' heads down. The door hissed shut, muffling the alarm scream. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing. The child he had saved from a cage, the alien girl bound by a life debt, had just protected the very family she had helped him find. Sarah didn't understand they were rescuing her. The alarms, the running, the armed man carrying her, it all fit into the framework of her conditioned existence. Transfers between owners were sometimes chaotic. New handlers could be rough. Her body went stiff in his arms, a board of unyielding tension. Her small hands pressed against his chest plate, not to hold on but to push away. The resistance was silent, absolute. She was fighting the one person trying to save her. The deep trauma made her resistant to any form of help. In her world, help was a lie that preceded punishment. Kindness was a test she had long since failed. Her eyes darted around the chaotic corridor, not with hope but with a bleak assessment of new threats. She didn't see freedom. She saw a transition from one controlled environment to another, possibly worse. Her entire being was focused on survival through obedience to a system that had broken her, not on escape from it. She spoke for the first time since he'd entered her room. Her voice was a thin, reedy thing, stripped of emotion. "Where is Master Darius?" The question was delivered with the flat tone of a required status report. "Is he displeased?" "I will perform better." The words were a knife twist. She wasn't asking about her father or her old life. She was concerned about the approval of the man who had stolen her childhood and displayed her toys as trophies. Her identity was now tied to the slaver's satisfaction. Nia moved closer, her bow now slung across her back. She spoke in her native tongue, a series of soft flowing phrases that sounded like water over stones. They were Azaran calming words used to soothe frightened young or ease pain. She reached out slowly, not to touch Sarah, but to let her see the gesture of peace. The alien words fell on deaf ears. Sarah's gaze slid over Nia without recognition or interest. The melodic sounds held no meaning for her. They were just another unexplained variable in a terrifying equation. The cultural bridge Nia tried to build couldn't span the gulf of Sarah's conditioning. Nothing penetrated the walls around her mind. Not his reassurances, not Nia's alien comfort, not the obvious evidence of their flight from danger. She was a locked box, and they didn't have the key. The conditioned responses were too deep, layered over years of systematic erasure. Hope was a concept that had been extinguished long ago. She was waiting for instructions from a dead man, her programming stuck in an endless loop of servitude. Leo remembered the weight in his pocket. He shifted his grip on her, holding her with one arm while his free hand dug into the inner pocket of his jacket. His fingers closed around the small, soft form. He pulled out the doll. It was a sad, ragged thing. The missing eye, the frayed yarn hair, the faded dress. He held it up where she could see it, letting it dangle from his fingers. He didn't say anything. He just let the object speak for itself. Her pushing stopped. Her eyes, which had been scanning for threats, focused on the doll. The blankness in her gaze flickered. Something stirred behind the flat resignation. It wasn't a memory, not quite. It was a sensory echo, a familiar shape, a texture known to her fingertips long before the metal cuffs and sterile rooms. Her hand, which had been pressed against his armor, slowly uncurled. She reached out, her movement hesitant, almost jerky. Her fingers didn't go for his face or his hand. They went for the doll. Her small hand closed around the worn fabric. Her grip was firm, possessive. She pulled it toward her chest, tucking it against herself like a shield. She didn't look at him. She didn't smile. But she held onto the doll, her fingers tracing the familiar crooked stitches on its dress. It was a connection, however faint, to a time before. A thread thrown across the abyss, so thin it was almost invisible, but there. For the first time, she was holding on to something from her past instead of the sterile present of her captivity. Heading for the nearest orbital port was the obvious move. It was also a death sentence. Darius's allies controlled the shipping lanes and docking bays. They would have alerts on every ship manifest, every passenger list. They'd be watching for a man traveling with 2 children, one human, one Azuran. The spaceports meant scanners, identity checks, and confined spaces with no escape routes. They offered the illusion of a path home but delivered only a trap. The math was clear. They had to go the other way, into the one place the slavers' influence didn't reach. They turned their backs on the ships and faced the mountains. Sarah needed a medbay, not a mountainside. Her physical wounds were superficial, but the deeper damage was a quiet emergency. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and shocky from years of psychological trauma. The thin, cold air of the high altitudes would strain her system. The rough terrain would test her fragile strength. Every step away from advanced medical care was a risk. He carried her most of the time, her small body a constant worrying weight against his chest. She barely made a sound, but her breathing was shallow, her grip on the doll the only sign of any awareness at all. The wilderness was the opposite of what her recovery required. The Azuran Mountains offered the only real sanctuary left. Nia's clan knew the deep caves, the hidden valleys, the paths invisible to orbital scans. They were a closed society, wary of outsiders, but they honored the life debt. They would provide shelter, security, and the kind of ancient, practical healing that didn't require registration or identification. It was a different kind of safety, one built on isolation and silence instead of technology and law. It was a step back in time, away from the complex danger they had just escaped. The journey was a harsh trade. They left the controlled environment of the market's dome for unpredictable weather and raw nature. The air grew thin and bitingly cold. The trail, where one existed, was loose rock and steep inclines. They slept in shallow caves or under rock overhangs, huddled together for warmth. He rationed their supplies carefully, knowing the next meal wasn't guaranteed. Sarah endured it all in silence, her eyes often closed, her face pale. The wilderness was a brutal environment for a broken child, a stark contrast to the sterile room she'd been kept in. It asked more of her than she had to give. Nia led them without hesitation. She moved through the labyrinth of granite and shale as if reading a map only she could see. She pointed out secure footing on treacherous slopes. She found hidden springs of fresh water. She identified edible roots and fungi, supplementing their dwindling rations. Her knowledge was innate, a birthright of her people. She was their guide through a landscape that felt alien and hostile to him, but was clearly home to her. Her small, confident form was a constant ahead of them, a blue speck against the vast gray stone. They navigated narrow passes that offered no cover from the wind. They forded icy streams that numbed their feet. They moved mostly at dawn and dusk, avoiding the heat of the day and the deeper cold of night. The constant travel was exhausting, a physical grind that left little energy for anything else. The immediate visceral danger of the market was gone, replaced by the slow, persistent challenge of endurance. The threat of pursuit faded, but the threat of exposure and starvation took its place. They had traded the certain, violent danger of slavers for the uncertain, grinding challenge of survival. Safety was no longer a locked door or a secure compound. It became a hidden cave with a clean water source. It was a day without sighting patrol ships overhead. It was the simple fact of putting another kilometer of harsh terrain between them and their enemies. The definition of security transformed from something external and technological to something internal and earned. Their safety now resided in their own resilience, their wits, and the guidance of a child who knew how to disappear into stone. Leo knew the rescue was only the first step. The real work lay ahead, a challenge with no clear enemy to fight. Getting Sarah out of the cage was one kind of mission. Helping her find her way back to herself would be another. He had to rebuild, not just extract. The soldier's job was over. The father's job was just beginning, and he had no manual for it. Sarah's recovery wouldn't be measured in days or weeks. The damage was too deep, layered over years of systematic erasure. It would take seasons, perhaps years of patient, quiet work. There would be no quick fix, no miracle treatment in a med bay. Healing would be a slow process of building trust, of proving safety through countless small, consistent actions. It was a campaign of patience, a war fought with whispers and stillness instead of rifles and rage. The timeline stretched out before him, vast and uncertain. He had no home to return to anymore. The mining outpost on Titan's Reach was just a memory, a place that existed 4 years in the past. His life there was gone, eroded by time and tragedy. There was no house waiting, no community that remembered him as anything but the man whose daughter was taken. Going back would mean returning to a ghost. He owned nothing but the gear on his back and the 2 children beside him. The future was a blank map, and he was responsible for charting its course. Nia's life debt was fulfilled. She had saved his life in return for his own act of salvation. The Azuran elders confirmed the balance was restored. The cosmic ledger was clear. She was free to return to her mother's people in the deep caves, to a life of safety and kinship. The obligation that had bound her to his dangerous quest was over. The logical path for her was to stay, to reclaim the heritage she had been stolen from. She chose to remain. There was no grand speech, no emotional declaration. She simply continued packing the few supplies they had, her movements practical and sure. When he asked her, his voice rough with the weight of the question, she looked at him with those calm, luminous eyes. "The debt is done," she stated, her tone factual. "The choice is mine now." Her choice was to stay. It was a decision made not from obligation, but from a bond forged in shared danger and silent understanding. She had found something with them that her own people could not offer. They became 3 people who had chosen each other. There was no shared blood between them, no common history or culture. Leo was a human soldier from a mining colony. Sarah was his traumatized daughter, a ghost of her former self. Nia was an Azuran refugee, connected to them only by a slaver's chain and a repaid debt. They were a family assembled from the broken pieces the universe had discarded. Their connection was built not on biology, but on the raw, hard facts of survival and the choices they made every day to remain together. Their home would not be a place on a star chart. It would be the life they built together day by day in the shadow of the mountains. It would be the shelter they constructed against the wind, the meals they shared from a single pot, the silent watches they kept under alien stars. Security became the sound of each other's breathing in the night. Belonging was the simple act of staying. The future was no longer about returning to something lost. It was about creating something new from the ashes of the old. Family ceased to be a matter of bloodline. It became a product of shared survival. It was the trust earned by standing back to back against a ridgeback. It was the loyalty shown by providing covering fire in a hostile corridor. It was the patience required to wait for a single spark of recognition in a blank gaze. Their bond was stronger than genetics because it was chosen, tested, and proven under fire. They were not father and daughters. They were crew. They were allies. They were a unit. And that was enough. They left more than a slaver's camp behind. The heavy cuffs that had bound Nia's wrists were discarded in the canyon dust, left to rust under the twin suns. The sterile, controlled room that had held Sarah was a memory fading with each step into the mountains. But the deeper chains were psychological. The conditioning that taught Sarah to ask for her master's approval. The survival instinct that told Leo to trust no one and abandon complications. The life debt that initially bound Nia to a path not her own. Those were the heavier links to break, and they worked on them every day in the quiet of the caves. Darius was gone, but the system that created him continued. His lieutenants would fight for control of his routes and contacts. New slavers would fill the vacuum he left. The market would keep operating, a hungry machine that consumed lives and spat out profit. His death was a victory, but not a conclusion. It was like cutting one head from a hydra. The body of the Enterprise was too large, too entrenched to die from a single wound. The threat remained, a constant, distant pressure on the horizon. Their freedom was a fragile thing. It existed in the margins, in the hidden places the slavers' networks didn't bother to chart. It depended on secrecy, on constant movement, on the goodwill of a reclusive clan. A single stray patrol ship, one careless transmission, one lucky scout could shatter it. Safety wasn't a permanent state. It was a condition they maintained through vigilance and the harsh geography of the high mountains. They were free, but they were not secure. The universe remained a dangerous place for those outside the established orders, but they possessed an asset the slavers could never understand or acquire. They had a bond forged in shared sacrifice. It wasn't a thing that could be bought on any market, or broken in any conditioning cell. It was the unspoken trust built when Nia chose to ride a ridgeback's spine to save him. It was the fragile connection sparked when Sarah's hand closed around her old doll. It was the quiet solidarity of three people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and had not looked away. This was their real strength, a defense built from loyalty, not armor. That bond became their primary resource. It was the tool they used to rebuild. Leo's military precision provided structure and security. Nia's ancient knowledge of the land provided sustenance and navigation. Sarah's slow, tentative steps toward healing provided a purpose that went beyond survival. They began to function as a unit, each person's strength compensating for another's weakness. The connection that started as a burden and a debt transformed into their central pillar. It was the one thing no external threat could ever take from them. The mission that began with the abduction of one child ended with the rescue of two. Leo had set out to find his daughter, a solitary quest fueled by grief and vengeance. He found her, but the path also led him to Nia. In saving the alien girl he never expected to find, he saved a part of himself he thought was lost. He rediscovered a capacity for protection that wasn't just about possession or bloodline. The two girls, one human and one Azuran, both rescued from different kinds of darkness, represented the completion of a cycle. The mission that broke his old life apart was the same one that gave him a new one, built on a foundation stronger than he could have planned. Leo's search began for one daughter, a 4-year hunt driven by vengeance. It found its meaning in saving another. The alien girl in the cage wasn't his mission, but she became his purpose. Sometimes the very journey that shatters a person is what forges them into something stronger. The mission broke his solitary life apart, but the pieces reassembled into a new foundation. He learned that home isn't a place on a star chart you return to. It's the people you choose to stand beside you in the quiet after the battle is done.